So if you really knew me, you'd know I'm a super huge movie buff, film nerd, all the things. I studied screenwriting in college, and in fact, a lot of the work that I do with students has been informed by my love of films. And so I thought it would be fun to interview some of my screenwriter friends and ask them about how their identities inform their storytelling and to give advice on writing and to get in and get nerdy about like structure and things. So episode one here, which you're about to watch, is with Dave Callaham, my friend who wrote Shang-Chi and the Ten Rings. He wrote Spider-Man Across the Universe and a bunch of others. And I ask him things like, when did you know you were a storyteller? What's it like trying to write a Marvel movie with really problematic, probably racist source material? And, what's the key to writing a great fight scene? And lots more. So that's what we'll get into here. Check out part 2 and part 3 with two of my closest friends whom you'll meet in those episodes. And for Dave's intro here, rather than do sort of like a cliche intro, we play a game called I Love and I Know, where he just shares some of the things that he loves and knows. So take a look.
I love heavy metal. I love over dramatics. I love your bookshelves and bookshelves in general, especially when they're full of books. I love a fireplace. I suppose I love my job these days. Sometimes I don't. I love professional wrestling, which falls into the over dramatics category. I love my family and my daughter and the hilarious person that she's evolving into rapidly. I love swimming. I love the energy of large events, but I don't always love going to them. And I love exploring new places.
Awesome. Let's do, there's a version of this called I Know. So it's like just things you know a lot about or could nerd out on.
Sure.
Sometimes there's overlap.
It's going to be a lot, yeah.
But go, what's your I Know list? Things you know a lot
I know
about.
a lot about air conditioning, which is not really a joke. I know a lot about movies and screenwriting. I know a lot about pop culture in general. It's a bit of a specialty of mine. I know a lot about rock and metal music, but not other music genres. I know a lot about martial arts and working out in general and physical fitness. I know a lot about competitive swimming. I know a lot about basic home handymanning. I know a lot about HVAC.
What kind of kid were you? What kind of high schooler were you?
The kind of high schooler I was probably a little bit different from the kind of kid I was. I was very academically minded growing up. I grew up in the Bay Area and did not have a lot of access to Western media and Western culture. I obviously lived in America in a very American school system, but we didn't have cable TV, we didn't have video games, and so that put me in a position to gravitate towards. My parents didn't listen to music, so it was kind of books or nothing growing up. So I was very into books and reading and the Wizard of Oz books, and I was very, very academically minded.
Yeah, what did you read? What were you into?
I read all of the Oz books, like not just the Frank Baum, but everything that came after. I was not into deep fantasy. That was more my brother's territory. He was like a Tolkien kid. Mm-hmm. He was also a comic book guy. People are always surprised to hear I didn't read any comic books growing up, really? Considering how I get paid now. But I also, I was very undersized, which is a big part of my story. I was born 2.5 months prematurely. Let's start at the beginning, Ethan.
Let's do it.
But it's relevant because, and I didn't even open my eyes for 2 months.
Yeah.
Like I was in the NICU. And so I was small my whole life. I was the smallest kid in my high school, women, men included. I was under 5 feet tall. And so as I got older, junior high and high school, I started to become aware of my stature or lack thereof. And that became a huge part of my identity. Just being aware that I was small and that I was, at the time you think of it more like shrimpy and then as you get into high school and you start going through puberty and becoming a young adult, you start thinking about it in terms of like virility and strength and masculinity. And so there was no way for me to grow taller. I did start lifting weights at that age entirely as a defense mechanism against, I would say the outside world, but it was also against my own insecurity, right? But the other shield I picked up along the way was a sense of humor. I thought, okay, well, there's no way for me to be a football player, so I'm going to be the funniest kid in the class. Right. And that resulted in me being pretty clever and quick-witted, I would like to think, but it also definitely resulted in me being a pretty big asshole. Just, the know-it-all, and I got in a lot of trouble with the teachers because I was always trying to make the class laugh. My goal was always the popularity that I perceive that I am going to be missing out on because of being small, but also being one of the only Asian kids in the whole school, by the way. I'm going to get back by making everybody laugh. So that made me a nuisance to teachers. And it also actually got me beat up more than I would have by only being small, because I was frequently targeting the jocks. So I had identified at that point, well, these are the popular kids and they have this thing that I want, which is popularity and good looks and all the trappings of American Western male success, right? Right. But I know that I'm smarter than them. And I know that they're not developing themselves in the same way I am intellectually, so I'm going to make sure everybody else knows it too. And so I was a real loudmouth. And that's what I was like in high school.
When did you start writing?
Creatively, I would say somewhere in that same vicinity in high school. I never explored storytelling on paper at that point in my life, but I was in public speaking. We had a very established public speaking program at my high school, which included student congress and debate and the things that a lot of people are familiar with, but also a whole other swath of things like where you would write a 10-minute speech, memorize it, and deliver it. And that could be entirely original, and you could play act parts inside of it. It could be a monologue. It could be a treatise on whatever you feel like. It could be anything.
Was this like speech and debate, like original oratory?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
original
sweet.
prose and poetry
Cool.
was the one I chose. I also did expository, which was a speech category where you had props.
Totally.
not quite Carrot Top, but like usually you would have an easel and you would make your own displays, I suppose. Now you would, I'm sure, do it all on a computer and do some sort of a slide deck. But
I remember this world. I was in the speech and debate world. It was an excuse to do more theater.
And I think of that as writing when I look back at it, and I think of it as performing, which it definitely was. And all of that is part of my life now, because in addition to writing, I do have to pitch to get jobs. I have to go into a room and express, no, this is what I'm envisioning for the character. So that's a form of writing I did. And then the other form was I was on a summer swim team my whole life, age about 7 to 18. Mm-hmm. And it was a really unique environment where my daughter's on a summer swim team now, and I know that it's not the same as what we had, and even the other teams we competed against at the time were not the same. We had this beautiful lake up on the hillside that someone had 100 years ago filled in with concrete. So it was not a swimming pool in the traditional square rectangle sense. And all around it was a park, like a giant park. And there was a place where you could buy food, and there was a coach's office, and there were benches, but it was all fenced in. So it was a self-contained environment, and people could play in the pool while swim team practice was going on because of the structure of the pool. There was sort of lanes in the middle, but otherwise you're just in a giant lake. And so you would get dropped off at like 8 a.m. for your morning practice, whether you were 6 or 18, and then you would just stay there all day. Mm-hmm. It was like a free babysitter for the parents. And so it taught me to, when I was young, I looked up to the older kids. And when I was older, I took care of the younger kids. And as part of that process, as we prepared for the big meet at the end of the year, there were always skits and performances to psych people up. And around the time I was 14, I was the person who was always assumed to be in charge of all of the skits, because I had watched the skits growing up and thought, I think there are, I think these are a little too standard, and I think there are ways to approach this that are more creative.
Yeah.
And so I sort of like made that my thing, and I look back now and I think of that as a form of writing as well.
Totally. When did you realize you were a storyteller?
I think probably around that time, especially. Public speaking was a really great tool to teach me how to feel comfortable literally, verbally telling stories, but my ability to create sort of these inspirational skits that would appeal to 6-year-olds and 18-year-olds, and then make the part of my goal was always like make the parents laugh.
Yeah.
And when I realized I could do that, and I was doing it at like a pretty, I don't want to say high level, but that was the only environment I knew. And it was working at 100% success rate inside of that small environment.
An extremely high summer swim team level.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
But, because it was a different audiences, kids, grown-ups, boys, girls, men, women, I knew that I was like tapping into something.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not so specific to myself that no one understands my storytelling. So like, I think I know how to do this at a wider level.
Lovely. Did you study writing in college?
Nominally, I was an English major, only because I didn't really know what my plan was. And that was the easiest thing for me to wrap my head around. I was really interested in biology, but I don't have a science mind.
Yeah.
I went to the University of Michigan, and that is one of, I assume, many schools that thinks of biology as like built out of chemistry.
Uh-huh.
And because I am terrible at chemistry and math, I was basically disqualified from pursuing that in college. So I went into English and, took all sorts of different classes, and there were writing classes, no creative writing classes. I've never taken a creative writing class. I've taken poetry. I've taken, most of my English focus was on literature and essay writing and comparative literature and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So you wrote one of my favorite Marvel movies, Shang-Chi and the Ten Rings. And one of the things that you said in an interview was that, I'm going to quote it, you said that you felt like your whole life was suddenly available to use. What do you mean by that?
Well, so I have been writing now over 20 years professionally as a screenwriter in LA, as a member of the Writers Guild. At that point that I got hired on Shang-Chi, it had to be 16 years. And all of those 16, 17 years, I had been writing stories that I hadn't considered this until Shang-Chi happened, but none of those stories were about anybody that looked like me or that had a life experience like me. I had written action movies, and I had written dramas, and I had written comedies, but they just never fell into a category that I considered anything resembling my own story. And the thing is, it didn't bother me. I wasn't searching for it. I don't actually think I knew that I was missing it or that it was even possible until Shang-Chi happened. And then Shang-Chi, obviously, if the listeners don't know, is a story of is the Marvel's first Asian superhero. And I am, despite my last name, I'm half Chinese. So it was suddenly a lot of the experiences that I had had with my own identity were available to me. The stuff I was just describing, I don't know where this edits in, but being one of the only Asian kids in a school, feeling othered, feeling self-conscious about who I was, and I'll never fit in for a variety of reasons, but most of them centered around that identity. And suddenly someone was asking me to tell a story about an Asian guy growing up in San Francisco, or not growing up, but living in San Francisco. What's that like for him? I thought, well, I know that. It's the first time I've ever, while I was writing, said, oh, I know, me,
Yeah. And I'm curious, like, to what extent, or if you can remember like examples or moments where it's in the film where it's like, that's where it's clearly you.
Well, the movie is edited in a way that there's a lot of different flashbacks to Shang-Chi's origin and his upbringing in China. Well, we're not supposed to say it's China, but it's China. But then he ends up in America, and he grows up being a little bit unaware of what's going on with his real family and what has become of his father, and his experiences in America and specifically in the Bay Area. That's very, very obviously drawn directly from my life. That is a place that I grew up. There's an early sequence. The first time you meet him, he's a valet at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, which is a hotel I've spent a lot of time in. That's not an accident. That's stuff that I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, why don't I just lean all the way in, and why invent something? I can just tap into stuff I know. So that early time in the Bay Area, and then, the sort of process of self-discovery that he undergoes over the course of the movie about finding out who he is and where he's from, is also something that I've experienced and in a way had experienced, but not really paid all that much attention to until I was writing that movie. So in a weird way, I felt like I was experiencing it with him as I was creating him.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Totally. And I want to double click on that. Say more about that. Because I've found, with students when they're working on college essays and personal statements, there is that sort of like art imitating life, life imitating art, going back and forth. To what extent did you feel like, what was that like, discovering yourself through the writing? Like, how did that happen?
It was really profound. I know I've maybe have told this story before, but I had a absolute freak out somewhere inside of the first several days of writing that script. I had been, the way it works at Marvel is you go into a room at the Disney lot and in the Marvel building, and you and the executive, or when I say you, I mean me and the executive and the director, we all just sit there and we work on story for months until we feel like that's the story. And then they say, go and write it, Dave. So then the warm blanket of other people goes away, and I go into a hole and I have to get interior. And about 3 or 4 days into that experience, I was writing the sequence when he's in San Francisco, and the version of it I had written maybe did trend a little bit more towards anti-Asian sentiment he might have been feeling at that moment in time. Mm-hmm. And that's a thing I felt in my life. And I kind of had an emotional freak out. And because it was the first time I'd ever written anything that, as you said, that I said, it's the first time. Right. It's the first time that I ever done that. I didn't even understand why I was having the emotional freak out. And the realization was like, oh my God, this is the first time I've ever been asked to or given the opportunity to speak from my own perspective. And it turns out that there is some stuff in there. That was the experience I was having. Was I thought I was pretty okay with all of it. And I was okay with it, but I did need to express a lot of things. And so it was a combination of feeling a little bit overwhelmed by doors that I had closed off inside myself opening again. And then it was also a feeling of gratitude, like, I cannot believe this is happening. Yeah. And a feeling of fear of, I better not fuck this up, right. Right. Because that means it instantly became more important to me than many of my other jobs. And I always try to be plugged into the work I do, but it was just going to be more important at that point. But that also meant that it was going to be more important to my family. Mm-hmm. And to other people who've had those experiences, to people who look like me or people who look not like me, but who have felt othered in that way. So the weight of it was very intense.
I'm curious about that too. Like, I wonder to what extent you felt that responsibility and how that responsibility actually ended up manifesting itself. In other words, I could imagine you going like way more political, for example, with the script.
Yeah, I tried a lot of stuff because I wasn't sure what the right balance was going to be, because I think it's not uncommon when the first time someone who has a lot to say is given a chance, is handed a microphone, you do have the instinct to just scream it all at once. It's and maybe that is appropriate in a particular situation, but I wasn't writing an original piece of material. I was writing inside of the Marvel system. And that means that there is a well-paved path that already sort of sets out the tone, the world, the sort of, I don't want to say rules, but historically, you haven't seen Marvel movies get really aggressively political. You know, I think Black Panther came pretty close, and I love it when they do that. And it doesn't mean that you can't do it, but you wouldn't do a lot of the same things in a Marvel movie that you might do if you were writing a movie for like Steven Soderbergh to direct at A24, right?
Right.
And so I tried a lot of scenes where I just had to get it out of my system to just rail at the system and what it's like being an Asian man in America and all the things I've felt for all this time, and then throw those scenes away, or show those scenes to Destin, the director, and my co-writer, who's also an Asian American male, but who had a very different experience as an Asian person in America than I did, because he grew up in Hawaii. And so he would read some of the stuff I would write and say, I haven't had this experience, and I think this is a little much. And sometimes he would write scenes, and I would say, I think there's a spot in here to say something. We don't have to go too hard at it, but you know. So it was a balance of trying to figure out how much do we want to say? What are we saving for later? What characters do we want verbalizing some of this stuff? Because my instinct was Shang-Chi is the hero of the movie, and he's me, quote unquote. He should say a lot of this stuff. But what we found later was that it became helpful for us to have Tony Leung's character verbalize a lot of his disgust with sort of the American prism of Asian experiences, because he's a person who lives outside of it and can look at it and point at it, versus when you're inside of it, sometimes you don't even notice what's happening to you. You're just a part of it, if that makes sense.
Right. I imagine that there were a lot of competing interests in terms of writing an action film that's funny, Marvel. And I want to get into some of the sort of the trappings of that in a little bit, but I'd love to talk a little more about process, because you mentioned that you were sort of given this thing and there was some conversation. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of like the source material that you were working with, and then what decision did you make to like embrace that or to throw that away? And we can talk generally about process, but since we're talking about Shang-Chi.
Sure. Well, with Shang-Chi, the Marvel system in general, which I know because I had worked there previous to this, and I had also pitched there a number of times where I had been the screenwriting bridesmaid on a number of projects, which turned out great because Shang-Chi was the one that made the most sense. Yeah. But what they do is they give you a giant packet. They send you a PDF, and it's all of the comics that they think are relevant to what they're looking for in a movie about so-and-so. In Shang-Chi's case, it was every comic that had ever been published featuring Shang-Chi, because he had a much thinner publication history. I have not ever seen like a Spider-Man packet, but I would imagine, but I have seen, I don't want to name movies I did not write, but I've seen the packets on characters with deep history, and what they do is they parse out, we like this version of the character. There's a storyline in this 10-issue run that we like, so take a look at that. And we can send you more if you want. And then they send you a document saying, these are the ideas we've been messing with that we think could be an interesting movie. So I got that. And the thing is, Shang-Chi was not a very well-known character. And the vast majority of the publication history on Shang-Chi was like from the 70s. Shang-Chi was created as a response to basically Bruce Lee, the sort of trend in America of... I don't think fetishizing is the right word, but like romanticizing sort of the mystical Eastern philosophy of Bruce Lee or even like Kung Fu.
And I imagine that when there's only one example from the perspective of American culture, that can happen.
Right.
Sort of
so it becomes super simplified,
right,
and really reductive. And that's what I don't think that there was ill intent. But the creators of Shang-Chi were not Asian, and they created the first few issues of Shang-Chi. He's wearing like a gi in New York City, just like literally wandering the streets in a gi and a headband. Yeah. And anytime he sees an injustice happening, he does kung fu on them. while spouting these massive chunks of like gobbledygook Eastern mysticism.
Yeah.
Right. Just weird platitudes that make no sense if you actually try to pay attention to what they're saying. But I think at the time it was thought of as like, ooh, how deep and mysterious this Asian culture is.
Right.
It's also worth noting that Shang-Chi in those books, the coloring that was used, the inks, he was like bright yellow.
Wow.
Like bright yellow. So, you know, you take one look at something like that as an Asian guy in 2017, and you're like, well, we're not doing this, right? I was actually for a split second like, I don't even want to talk about this.
Right.
It's so offensive.
Yeah.
And the other main element, so that's what Shang-Chi was like as a character and as like a tone. And his father in the comic books was named Fu Manchu, and he was exactly what you imagine. He was literally the Fu Manchu caricature that we're all familiar with, which is a deep racist stereotype and imagery that was pretty common for a long time in American like pulp writing. But you know, the long beard and the very overly slanty eyes and sort of like the sorcerer thing, you know, the Asian sorcerer, which I do like Asian sorcerers, but it was a bit much. And so to Marvel's credit, they said, look, we know this is all fucked up.
Yeah.
We're not after this. What we're after is we want to put an Asian superhero on screen, and we do think it would be interesting if we explored the notion of a family relationship, a father-son schism that has happened in the past, and am I destined to follow my father's footsteps? That was all in there. It was just completely shrouded in racist overtones, and so that I thought, okay, so they know that we're going to throw this all out, which is really unusual at Marvel because historically, like, you would actually get in trouble for that. Spider-Man fans, if you change the whole backstory, would be like, how dare you, right?
Right.
Rightly so. But with Shang-Chi, we basically were the only Marvel movie that I'm aware of up until that point who were told, you're basically creating something original.
Wow.
And you're going to use touch points from the comics and characters from the comics, but you're going to have to rebuild a huge swath of it. And so that was really exciting and freeing. Also scary,
I bet,
because you don't have any guardrails. I don't have a place where I can go and look up, what did he do in this period of his life? Like we had to make it all up.
Yeah.
So that was the process. I don't remember where the question started.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. It was like, I was curious about the sort of beginnings of it. And then I'd love to just talk a little bit about, and you could talk about Shang-Chi or just in general, when you're writing, when you're working on a movie, what's that routine like? Do you have a routine, and how does that tend to go?
I'd like to have a routine. I prefer to have a routine. I am very much at the mercy. My job is so, it changes so frequently because I'm on a project. Shang-Chi, as an example, I was on for probably 2 years total of writing, but eventually it ends. And Shang-Chi I was the first person hired on the movie, and I was the last person to lock the door behind me on the way out. I worked all the way through, rewriting stuff right up until the premiere. But sometimes I write a single draft, and 3 months later I'm fired.
Yeah.
And so every single job changes the pacing of it. You know what? Like I mentioned with Shang-Chi, I was going into an office 3 times a week, which I had never done. But what I like the best is once I've been sent a script, which is the point at which I'm told by myself usually, but I do collaborate too. Time to go write. You have about 3 months usually to write a script generally. My general process would be, once I know what the movie is, we could talk about getting to that moment. I get up in the morning with my family. I do the family stuff. I work out of a space in our home, and I like to go out there. And I basically have 2 chunks of time that I think of as like blocks. And there's a third one available to me if everything is going terribly wrong, which I prefer not to have to use, but some version of a morning block, which is not 8 but 9 to noon or 1, I will let that go as long or as short as the flow is carrying me. Somewhere in the middle of the day, I try to take a break, and usually that involves a workout or a lunch or yard work, something that is not in front of a computer screen, which is what I do my work on. And then there's an afternoon block, which is whenever that break has ended through to whenever family time starts again. And that's different depending on if I'm picking our daughter up. Sometimes I'm not picking our daughter up, so I'm writing deeper into the evening. I am typically the person cooking dinner, so that at some point I stop writing, I do family stuff. I would like to be done working at that moment, but if I'm on a deadline or I've lost time elsewhere, there's a night block available, which is, could be 7 to whenever, just to catch a couple more hours of writing if I need to. And so that's how I like to structure it if I can, but there's a billion distractions along the way.
Yeah, especially being a dad.
Yeah. It's easier now. I mean, the first couple of years of her life, there was no structure. It was, when can I steal writing time to keep this thing fed?
Right. You mentioned, and we talked about this a while ago, but you mentioned, for example, with Spider-Man, that there was writing until, like, the movie was getting ready to come out a couple weeks later, and you were like, there's still writing happening. Can I say that?
Yeah.
I mean, my question is, like, I imagine it varies, but when you say writing up until the premiere, like, talk about that a little bit. Like,
yeah, I mean, on Shang-Chi, I'm exaggerating a little bit. I only mean that I wrote until there was no more writing to be done. But on a Marvel movie, that does typically mean that you're doing reshoots or you're writing ADR lines or voiceover lines, as long as you can get away with it until there is a moment on a live action movie where you have to lock picture and you just can't change anything anymore because it's got to be dispersed to all these people.
Right.
In animation, you can do that much longer because...
Yeah, talk about that difference. The difference of writing for animation versus live action.
Well, in animation, you can just iterate forever. People tend to think it's free. It's not free. It costs a huge amount of money to do that.
Yeah.
But with live action, generally speaking, and Marvel is the most iterative version of it, where you write a script, they go and shoot that script. They're usually changing things the entire time. And then at the end of the process, they've shot what they've shot. They put it together in the edit. We work on it for a while, try to find the best version of the edit. But the whole time you're taking notes, knowing that you're going to write new stuff that's going to plug holes that you've discovered, right?
Right.
So there's several different writing periods. But again, what ends up on screen is limited only to the moments in time where you have sent out a 200 plus person crew to go and rounded up your actors and you've shot the material. Now, I don't know if this is going to change with where we're headed technologically, but that is currently what you're limited to. With animation, the people making the movie, the animators, the artists, everybody, they are in an office building and you have access to them up until the day the movie comes out, which means that if you say, I want a new scene that does this, I mean, they can't do it overnight, but you can change things all the time, constantly in animation, as long as you're willing to pay the people who are putting in the work.
And so how close was that with, for example, Spider-Man? Like how much writing was happening up until what point before it premiered?
I was told, I was not a part of this process, and I won't cite what it was. There was a single line of dialogue that was changed the week of the premiere, or it might have been after the premiere. There's a period, the premiere of a movie is usually somewhere the week before or 2 weeks before the release of the movie. So whatever that window is, there was a line of dialogue that at the very last second we realized might be, it wasn't intended to be offensive or even particularly comedic. It was just a thing a character said, and then something happened in the real world, like a big news event happened.
Yeah.
And suddenly this line seemed to be a reference to it. So we changed it a week out from the movie being in the theater, and, and we can do that. I don't know how that would be possible in live action.
One of the things I'm curious about, so to what extent, where is Dave, and I'm putting Dave in quotes for people who are listening, in movies? So there are ways that you've talked about in Shang-Chi that you showed up, but when you talk about like The Expendables, for example, or like Mortal Kombat, like where are you in those movies?
Well, I mean, the truth is frequently, just as often as I am in some of these movies, with Shang-Chi, I was always involved. With Spider-Verse, I was always involved. A couple of the smaller movies I've written, I was involved a lot more. But with The Expendables, as an example, and Mortal Kombat, I wrote early drafts of those scripts, and then they went away from me, and there were other writers involved. And that typically results in a final product where even though my name is on those movies, that usually means that the structure and ideas started with me, but by the end of the process, a lot of character and dialogue stuff is the stuff that changes the most as you get further down the line, because you're bringing in actors and maybe they have new ideas. So, Mortal Kombat is a thing that I did because I love Mortal Kombat. I wasn't 100% sure I knew how to do Mortal Kombat or improve upon the first very campy but wonderful Mortal Kombat film that I still love to this day. But I do have a general rule where if somebody brings me something that is meaningful to me from a point in my life, and I still spark to it, and I say in my head, oh man, that would be awesome. A Mortal Kombat movie, that'd be awesome. And then you're giving me an opportunity to be a part of it. I try to figure out a way to find a story that I think I can make work for that. Like I just think I'm always tickled by the idea that I can be working on something that, what would 7-year-old Dave think when he was playing with He-Man toys? Now that I'm writing a He-Man movie, for example, which is a thing I worked on for a period of time. I don't know what will happen with that movie, but so it's mostly just the joy of working on something that I love is in the movie, I would hope. The Expendables sort of was, I suppose, a reference to the movies I grew up on. I said earlier that I didn't have a lot of Western culture. I grew up in the 80s. And so though we didn't watch movies in my household, once I started visiting friends' houses, what everybody was watching was Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone and Jean-Claude Van Damme.
Right.
And I fell in love with those movies just like everybody else did. This was, that was the era. And that is what The Expendables is a love letter to, ultimately. That's, I suppose I'm always looking, I only know how to write stuff that I think I would love. And so, in terms of the sense of, like Godzilla, I worked on the 2014 Godzilla film that has now spawned a number of increasingly fun,
Good word.
if not scientifically implausible films, but I love them. And I was so happy to work on that. I loved Godzilla as a kid. That was one of the very few things my mom did show me. She loved Godzilla movies. And so when they came around and there was an opportunity to write a Godzilla movie, and I thought of how much my mom loved it and how much I have this memory of watching them with her, and the fantasy of that time when you couldn't make anything appear on screen magically with computers, right? Like it was a guy in a giant rubber suit and it still felt incredible to be, well, I cannot believe I'm seeing this. I always try to bring that wonder to what I'm doing.
There was, I forget who said it. There was a screenwriter who said once that the most important decision you'll make as a writer, and I think he was particularly talking about screenwriters, is the decision about what to make next. So I'm curious, how do you decide what to write next, and to what extent do you get to choose? I mean, certainly you're always the one who's choosing, but what are the forces that are impacting that for you?
I mean, for me personally, I'm the one who's choosing because I'm in a very privileged position of having a long career and having a number of successful movies under my belt, which puts me in a position where people want to work with me. That has not always been the case in my career. So I do know what it is to not really have a choice. And so there's I guess, two parts to that question that might be more relevant to people listening. There's many times as an artist, especially an artist for hire, which you are as a screenwriter, where you don't get to choose. You have the choice of writing a spec, for example. You can always write an original story, and that is a risk because you may or may not make money doing it. But if it's for the endeavor of the creative process, then that's a thing you can do. But if you're looking for a job, quote unquote, and you are relying on what is being offered to you or what you might be in a position to chase down, so you don't always have that many options, you know, and that can feel scary. And that is how you end up sometimes taking jobs that might not be 100% right for you, or that you don't feel confident that you can really do a great job on. But you gotta pay the mortgage, you gotta buy groceries, and I've had that in my life. And in those moments, all I've ever tried to do is think. I have tried to not let the full existential panic of existence in our capitalist society drive my decision making. Here we go. So I've always tried to, like, don't just take it because you need the money. I try not to do that. There have been moments where I just had to do it, and I will tell you, the result was never good creatively. I got paid. I was able to stay alive for a period of time longer, which landed me here to here to here to here. So I owe a lot to those moments, but the creative process was always tortured because it wasn't honest, and the final result was usually terrible. Now, my process allows for me to be very picky because I get to look at a lot of things. That, of course, is still dictated by the ebbs and flows of Hollywood. You know, the number of superhero movies that I was hearing about 3 years ago is not the same as the number of superhero movies I hear about now. You know, now people are nervous about superhero movies for the first time in 15 years. So
Why is that?
because they haven't been performing as well financially. There's been a couple of Marvel movies that have not performed at the level that maybe the previous versions had. I think that there's a fatigue involved. I think that the streaming element resulted in an oversaturation of material. There were a lot of Disney Plus Marvel shows. There were other studios making superhero movies. Everybody's doing superhero movies, you know, and I think there's a point where the audience got, you know, stepped back and said, you need to show me a new version of this, or something just so excellent. You know, Black Panther's not just a superhero movie. That's like a Best Picture candidate. You know, that breaks through, but it's changing every day what people are responding to, and that results in Hollywood panicking about what they're going to respond to in 3 years, which is the game you're trying to play.
Right.
So what I'm seeing today is different than what I was seeing 5 years ago, but all of which is to say, I do have the ability to choose, which is nice. And what I have been doing recently is you just don't know what's around the corner. And again, because I write material that has to be consumed by a mass audience to be successful, I'm following those trends. So what I try to do is be patient with. It's very hard. I get nervous all the time. I need to have a lot of jobs in front of me, but I try to be patient and not worry about what's going to happen, because any day of the week, on a weekend, any time of the year, I can get a phone call and it's Shang-Chi, and I go, holy shit, this is the thing I've been waiting for. And the day before, I thought I was never going to work again. So I try to just let it come to me, and I don't know what I'm going to want to do. You know, I can tell myself, I think before Shang-Chi, I was like, I think I'm done chasing Marvel movies. I love Marvel movies. I've tried to get hired on Marvel movies, and I've gotten so close, and everyone over there has always treated me so well, but it must just not be in the works, and it hurts too much to keep chasing them and losing them. And then Shang-Chi came, and it changed everything again. So I have a sense of storytelling types. Like I enjoy writing comedy a lot, because the world sometimes feels heavy to me, and it's hard to write heavy material and then end my day and turn on the TV and I'm inundated with heavy life. I like when writing's an escape. But what I try to do on top of being patient with the material coming to me is I always have one or two secret things that my agents don't know about, that sometimes multiple people know about, and sometimes only my wife knows about. I have a thing now that I've been doing that I'm not getting paid for. It's an experiment that I'm trying something with a partner, and that allows me to not be confined to like only being creative when I'm being paid for it,
right?
But also even when I'm being paid for it and I'm getting to do really creative, fun stuff, Shang-Chi, or maybe like a Zombieland, right? Where it's like this very freewheeling, fun world and kind of everything is allowed. Mm-hmm. But you are still writing in those moments knowing that there's like large corporate overlords looking over your shoulder.
Right.
So I know I could write the funniest thing in the world. It's a little, blue, like it's a little blue. And I just like, they're never gonna let me do this. So I'll just cut it right now.
Right.
Once you start doing that, you're writing for them. So the idea of having something that I'm writing on spec or experimenting with on the side at all times allows me to have a safe place to feel like I'm scratching that itch, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's an interesting copy paste for between what you're talking about and this position that I find students in when they're writing their personal statement. Is there's this interesting dance between the what they want and versus the story that I want to tell, or that the student feels like, this is something that I find compelling, that I feel agency around. And then there's sort of that ambiguous, like, I don't know, I'm guessing that this is what people want, or like as you mentioned, in 3 years. And so there's like that, seems like there's that constant dance.
Yeah, it's really significant. And I can speak to it in terms of what I do for a living, but what I would say for students listening, and this does apply to how I approached the process back when I was applying to college, I would mention, you're writing a thing that you know somebody's reading, and you're trying to please the person, right, and or the people or whoever it is, the institution, and that's stressful, and you're trying. That's the what they want. What I would always recommend personally, and I'm not responsible if this doesn't work, so I apologize. But what has worked for me, and I've seen evidence that it might be a good path, is I believe that everyone should try to when creating in this situation, go as far in the what I want field as you believe you can get away with, up until the fence of now you're going to fall off the cliff and really like lose them. And here's what I mean by that. Like, as an example, I have a friend who is a very dynamic personality, and when you're around him in person or on text message, riotously funny, quick-witted, just a great fun person to be around, and this person's a screenwriter, and the material that he writes is so flat and boring.
Wow.
And every time I ask him about it, he's like, well, the studio told me, and it bums me. Now he's a working screenwriter, so obviously it has worked. His intellect and his writing ability is still excellent. But I've always felt like, man, if he was putting on the page what I'm getting in the room, I do think that there are higher heights that he can achieve as a writer. Because
have you told him that?
Yeah, I have. But that also puts my personality on him and supposes that he's willing to do that. Right. And the first 10 years of my career, I was writing solely from a what they want perspective, because I was so happy to be there. I needed work. I didn't want to turn people off. It's so competitive. And I thought, I'll just be a good soldier, and I'll just write what I'm being asked. And I was writing a very muted version of myself, but very functional writing, like high quality prose without a lot of voice. So I actually know this personally. And after I worked on Godzilla, I kind of felt I just felt stifled. And that was not anybody's fault on that project, or I had imposed upon myself this invisible stricture of I better just write a very down the middle thing that they want. After that project, I kind of lost my mind and said, I need to see what it would be like to write, like what it sounds like in my head. What would that look like on the page? And what that meant for me was all of the rules of screenwriting needed to be thrown out. You get told you can't write something down on the page that won't be on screen. Don't write like little asides to the reader. They're a waste of time. And I thought, yeah, but they'll also make the read more interesting, which will color the opinion that the person has of the material, which, et cetera, et cetera. So I wrote, I was hired to write. In this case, I pursued a job came to me that was comedic. It was the first time anyone had ever thought of me for a comedy, and it was because it was a person who knew me and knew. I suspect actually had the same opinion of me that I had of this other writer. Like, Dave is a lot more funny and dynamic than his writing would suggest. I wonder if he'd want to do comedy. And I got really lucky, and I jumped on it. I got paid next to nothing because it was for a tiny company, but I was willing to sacrifice where my career was headed because I believed that this left turn was worth trying. And I wrote this really wild, freewheeling script with like a lot of very strange flourishes on the page, and it was the first time I ever felt like that's kind of what I sound like. This is Dave, and that script completely changed my career. It blew open every door still closed to me. I got considered for jobs I would have never gotten considered for, and more importantly, I think people suddenly understood, oh, Dave's just not another person who kind of falls into the pack of this genre of writer. Like, this person is a voice, and when we want something specific, we know this is one of those guys we can go to for that thing. So and again, I was writing for a company. I knew that there were still rules. So all of that was up until that line of what they want. Here's as much as I think I can get away with,
right,
is what I did. And now that's the only way I know how to write.
So I want to nerd out for a little bit on structure, because it's a thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, particularly as it relates to movies and also just storytelling. So how important is structure when it comes to screenwriting?
Somewhat important. It depends on the project. I think 75% of movies that you see follow a pretty standard, tried and true structure. There are a lot of wonderful movies that do not follow the structure of what you might be taught in film school, and those work too. But you generally have to be quite a steady hand and quite talented to pull off experimental structure, I would say. And like two examples might be on Across the Spider-Verse, which I did work on, though I am not responsible for the section I'm about to talk about. The movie opens with a 20-minute section that's focused entirely on Gwen and her relationship with her father. So we were told many times along the way, and again, I didn't write that sequence, and for quite some time I was one of the people telling, oh, you can't do that. Gwen is not the main character. We need to see Miles much sooner than this. But it worked, and it worked because the way that sequence is written is really heartfelt, and it also worked because we were operating inside of a medium where the visuals of what was happening are astonishing.
Yeah.
And so you're getting away with something. Another example might be probably Oppenheimer, if anyone has heard of that. It's a movie from last year that Christopher Nolan made, and the structure of that movie is a little unusual as well, and it's the huge chunks of that movie are basically montages. And that is why that movie, even though it is about a historical event that we all know the history of, still feels like a thriller, in my viewing at least, and I've heard other people say it. So those are examples of, to get away with unusual structure, you are operating inside of genre-busting animation, or you are one of the great auteurs of his generation, right? I'm not sure I would recommend people blow away structure right out of the gate. I think, the way I learned to write was I followed very strict structural rules, and then only once I felt like I understood those did I start pushing the boundaries and wondering what it might look like for me to question structure, what parts of structure are important to me, what parts of structure are important to audiences, and experimenting with that. And I do think that the wall is not made of steel, but, between what's correct and what's incorrect. I think it's rubbery. I think you can push and pull a little bit, but it's different for every project.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about, like, as you're sharing this, I'm going, God, there are a couple structures when it comes to like students working on college essays that work. There's the sort of classic narrative structure, which is like the challenge and then the impacts, and then here's what I did about it and here's what I learned. And then there's this sort of like what I would call a montage structure, which is like, here are some different moments from my life and they're connected by this common thematic thread.
Yeah, I mean, remember, I in college was an English major and was mostly focused on like comparative literature, and that just means essay writing essentially. And there was very strict structures that I was told I had to follow. And I messed around a little bit, but generally, my writing career and my writing experience as a human has been one of learning structure and sticking to structure in college, in essay writing, in creative writing, in screenwriting, for the majority of my life, up until a moment where it was finally time for me to explore around it. But I do believe pretty strongly that you have to learn structure before you can explode it.
And how does that fit for you in terms of the way you like to do things, like in life? Like, are you sort of like, were you sort of like, yes, give me the structures, or were you one to be like I was, more resistant and like, no, I want to do it my own way? Like, what has been your relationship, I guess, to structure over
I
the years?
think my personality type generally required, I'm like a dog, I guess. Like, they always say, like, dogs want a structure. They want,
Right.
they
need it.
They like being in the crate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel a little unsafe when I don't know what the parameters of something are at all. And so, my memory of it might be a little hazy now in terms of like essay writing, but I always want to know what the rules are. And it's only fairly recently that I've felt comfortable enough with myself to know I can get away with breaking some of them without being, like bad, quote unquote. But yeah, I generally, so I want to know what the rules are. And then almost immediately after hearing the rules, I will have a moment where I go, you can't tell me rules.
Yeah.
I do have that part of me, but so like it's a little bit at odds. And like visually I present as a person who might tell you like, I don't live by any rules, but it's all fake. It's all just, armor I wear because of who I was when I was younger. And yeah, the truth is both of those things can be true. Like I guess that's the duality of who I am is I need structure. I need rules. I want to be a good person. I have a very strong moral compass. I want to, do what I'm told. And I also want to push back, but I want to push back in a safe way. I want to push back. What I don't have in me is like the desire to ever write a script that is like totally avant-garde. It will always be reflective of the classic structure, and just you will always be able to identify where I left the tracks versus something that is just amorphous. I don't have the ability to do that. I'm so in awe of artists, musicians, especially when you hear something that's just like genre busting in a way that you've never heard of before. I think I have an ability to have a very unique voice inside of set structures. I'm not sure I have the ability to change the notion of screenwriting forever.
But you mentioned armor and sort of like the way that you present. Will you out yourself for a minute? Like, what are some of the ways that you mean, like when you say the armor, or the ways that, yeah, like when you say, how do you present, and then what is actually true?
Well, I've been told that I present as very intimidating.
Why do you think that is?
Because I am covered in tattoos. My arms, my neck is probably the area that really triggers people to suspect that there's something dangerous about me. I have long hair that's tied into what would be called a samurai bun, probably if I was Japanese. I have a lot. I have earrings. I don't know. I think I look.
You also dress cool.
Sure. I wear a lot of t-shirts. A lot of black t-shirts.
But like cool black t-shirts.
Cool black t-shirts. I do have a story about that might be relevant. All of which is to say, like, this is what makes me feel comfortable and how I feel safest. And I think that there is definitely a part of me that enjoys like sending the message like, please leave me alone.
Yeah.
Because I'm scared of the world.
Yeah.
But usually when people get to know me, they do. Almost everybody who's gotten to know me, like going into the life of a parent has been a very wild experience for me because it changes the way you interact with the world entirely, right?
Totally.
And I was tattooed before I had a kid, but became more tattooed afterwards because I think I just became more comfortable and more confident in myself. But that also means that like a lot of the situations in which I'm meeting people are now like parent based. It
Right.
used to be like the only times I meet people is at work or socially or at a bar.
Right. And that's like 80% of us hanging out too, is like, we're at school.
And now it's just like go to a school event and I meet other parents and everyone's a little nervous and you're thinking like, what are these people going to be like? And am I going to suck with these people for 12 years? And I get those, and I've made wonderful friends like you and a lot of great people along the way at the school we're at now and at the preschool we were at previously. But almost every single person that I've become friends with along those, in both of those situations have told me like, oh boy, I took one look at you and was like, there's the scary dad. But you're not scary at all. I'm like, oh, thanks, I guess.
Thanks.
It's working. It allows me to choose. The story I think I should tell though is that at the same period of my career where I was starting to feel a little flustered by structure and by not expressing my full voice that I was describing earlier, when I turned 30, so I broke in pretty young as a screenwriter. I broke in when I was like 24. So when I turned 30, I thought, okay, 30 is grown up. 30 is a real man. I've been, playing things a little fast and loose. I've been acting a little immature, I think, not taking jobs as seriously. I don't think I was as professional as I wanted to be. And so when I turned 30, I thought, okay, it's time to grow up. So I went to the Grove, and it's a mall in Los Angeles, and I bought a bunch of like pleated khakis and button-up shirts.
Wow.
And like shoes. I'm a flip-flop guy, so I bought like nice shoes, and I built this whole wardrobe of this is what a 30-year-old grown-up professional looks like. Okay? And I did not have any visible tattoos at the time. I had lots of tattoos, but I had been very carefully making sure that they were all obscurable. I did, like, the back of my neck was tattooed to the exact line where a button-up shirt would go.
Yeah.
Because I'd had, like, the artist draw a line right there and said, do not go past this line.
Yeah.
I don't want people to be scared of me. And I then proceeded to have the worst year of my career because every fucking meeting I went into, I was cosplaying a person that I wasn't.
Right.
I was pretending this, and some people are very comfortable in that particular outfit, and that is who they are, and they're confident in meetings, and that gives them a power. It took my power away, and I felt awful. I felt like I left every single meeting like, boy, I don't even know who they think I am. I'm not sure I know who I am. After a year of it, I said, it's not working. I'm just going to go fully in the opposite direction, and where I'm going to look exactly like I feel on the inside. And so I started wearing basically a uniform of jeans and a t-shirt, and I grew my hair out, and I was like, I've always wanted like my tattoos to extend beyond this, and I was scared, and I'm just going to do it, and we'll see. If they hate it, they hate it, but at least I'm like being honest with myself, because I do not want to feel like I felt for that year.
Right.
And that was a very eye-opening experience. Wow. Because I think it's twofold. I think that I felt much more comfortable.
Yeah.
I felt like I was going into those rooms loose and like, hey man, this is who I am, and this is what you get. I will say, I do also think that there was an effect on studio execs where they are like, I'm the librarian. I don't want to hire a creative person who is also an accountant. Like, I want someone who looks like a psychotic genius.
Right.
Like, I want someone who looks creative.
Right.
I don't want to tell my boss I hired the guy who looks like he works down the hall from us. I want to tell my boss I hired the person who's
totally.
You're not going to believe like how wild this person is. I'm not saying that that's how I present, but I do believe that there's an element of that helped me. Anyway, that's my story about why I present the way
I love that. God, I love that.
Who I am, and it is also beneficial to me.
That to me feels like another, not resisting finding themes, another voice finding moment. And I don't mean your writerly voice, but just the who you are sort of identity. And it was like, well, here I'm going to present in this way. And that's stayed mostly. And maybe it'll shift.
I feel so comfortable physically now. And like when I look in the mirror, I don't know. This is like a whole other conversation. What you feel of yourself when you look in the mirror. Mm-hmm. But when I look in the mirror now, there's no stranger. There's no disgust of look at that puny little kid. There's no I wish I could be something else. Mm-hmm. Which we all have versions of experiences along the way. Like I mean, there's things I don't love about myself that's the human condition. We're always trying to work on that interior and exterior, but I will say that I do feel, like I said before, like I feel like what you see when you look at me is pretty much how I feel.
Yeah.
Which is important to me.
Yeah.
It really affects like how I go out into the world when I like, my wife always laughs when we go to a wedding and I'm like, oh God, I have to put on a monkey suit, and I make a big joke out of it. But the truth is, I can wear a suit, but you will find that you are getting a socially different version of me than you're getting right now, because it makes me feel buttoned up and not quite as myself as I'd like to be.
Totally. Yeah, at a wedding last week, and I had the same feeling of like, I'm in a costume. Yeah. And so back to rules for a second, and as it relates to writing, what were some of the rules, as it were, of the Marvel universe that you feel, okay, we've got to make sure that we do these things, and yet there's still this desire to like tell this story that you're excited about? Like, yeah.
Well, and just to say, it's not like Marvel will give you a literal list of rules. They're very, I think the thing that has led to their success is they're very freewheeling and open to new ideas and to change.
Right.
The thing that I love about them is once they hire the people that they hire, generally they trust you. They say,
cool.
We hired you for a reason. If you believe in this and you are willing to stand up for it, go do it. Now, if it doesn't work, we're going to chop your legs out the first chance we get, but we're going to give you the opportunity. And I love that. And so in terms of like the larger rules of the universe, I think what they don't tell you anything. They just they assume that you understand, look, I'm not writing in a vacuum where it's a singular story that just happens in its own little world.
Right.
There are, I don't know how many movies now, but 20-something movies that have come before that have very clearly laid out certain things that have happened in this universe. There are
things we expect.
Rules of, like there are superheroes in this world, for example. There are aliens in this world, for example, that not only aliens, but aliens that everybody is aware of. Everybody in this world, one time, had either vanished into thin air for 5 years or had all of their friends vanish into thin air. Like, we all
Spoiler alert.
I don't need to be told that these are this is the world I'm operating inside. So there's those rules, that just the understanding that you are operating inside of that, and you are to be, you might need to reference those things every now and again, and you should also be respectful of those things. Right? You can't just go half-cocked and change things just because you want to, or violate, sort of the rules. And then there's, sort of also unwritten tonal rules, which is just to say Marvel movies, generally, they can take a lot of forms. Like there's Black Panther, which does lean more into like ideas of identity and colonialism. And then some of the Captain America movies, the earlier ones, trend more towards political thrillers. But even inside of that, I think every Marvel movie has action, has heart, and has humor. There's not a lot of like, if you, as an example of what they're not, if you look at some of the movies that DC was making at the same time, some of the Zack Snyder movies, he made a couple of pretty humorless Batman and Superman movies, which have their fans and they're great in their own ways. Maybe didn't resonate financially in the same way that the Marvel movies did, and draw your own conclusions. But point being, no one would ever have allowed you to make that tone of movie at Marvel if you came in and tried it.
You know what I realize as we're talking is it lacks that self-awareness that you see to greater or lesser extent. One like Thor: Love and Thunder, which goes way to like that we are making a movie and we're having fun and look at us, in a way that I find really delightful. I'm curious, just to drill in, because we talked about this right before we started recording. When it comes to like fight scenes, will you talk a little bit about the how a fight scene, like what did you learn about fight scenes, or how did you play with it, for example, in Shang-Chi?
Shang-Chi was like, for me, the ultimate opportunity to show everybody, like, this is my number one skill set as a writer is fight sequences.
Cool.
Even though I find it rather boring to write fight sequences. And I believe that that's happened because my writing career as a screenwriter started with more serious action and then segued into action comedy. But when you're writing more serious action, you have to learn how to write action. And most people can't do it. A lot of times you will open an action screenplay and what it'll say is like, there's a fight here.
Yeah.
Right? And you can get away with that because the truth is no action movie that you will ever see, the action on screen will never be based solely on the words on the page. There is a stunt team and a stunt coordinator who comes in and designs a fight sequence. But I've also dabbled in the martial arts, so I have like personal experience. I know what it is to be punched and kicked in certain parts of my body. I know what it is to be choked unconscious. So between the history of writing action and personal experience of, I've never been in a street fight, but you know, I know less than those people and more than a person who's never been choked unconscious. And I bring that as well. And then I started writing comedy, so I started bringing that into the action. And so by the time I was hired at Marvel, I was like, you got the guy. I know how to do this. And what I do now...
Yeah, what is it that you know? Why are you good at it?
So why I'm good at it is I know what because again, you can write action scene happens here, and you'll get away with it. Mm-hmm. But if you are trying to write something, again, to the point I was making earlier, that is fun to read and makes you feel like I understand what this is. I know what this movie is. I know what the writer's trying to convey. I need a director to be able to read it and know exactly what I'm telling him or her so that they can go shoot. Or if they have a different idea, then I'll rewrite it. But I want there to be an expression of what the fight sequence is. And what I mean by that is, that means for me, a general description of the action on screen, which means with that bus sequence as an example, you write all of the setup, you write the interaction that leads to the fight, and then the guy in this case has a sword for a hand. That's important to note. And then, you know, instead of writing punch for punch, he throws a right cross, the other guy slices, then the other guy does a kick, and then a left cross, and then a jab. Like, there are people who write like that too, and maybe that works for them. I find it boring to read. What I'll write is, the fight begins, and very quickly it's apparent that Shang-Chi Sean in this moment in the movie is an absolute marvel. Like you have never seen anybody fight this quickly with his hands. And that's important because what I'm actually doing is not describing the fight, I'm describing the story of what's happening for Katie.
Yeah.
Because Katie thought that Sean was a valet who had never been in a fight in his life. And suddenly this mask, not literally, but this proverbial mask is coming off. And she is seeing something she didn't know people could do, and it's her friend doing it who she didn't know. And so I'm telling you the story of the fight instead of the beat for beat of the fight.
Right.
And then it just progresses. And so as I'm getting further into that, the story has to progress. And now he's in real danger. And now Katie's experience, and I'm telling all this through Katie's experience because the truth is that's who this fight was for. So it was a moment in the movie where you realize like this person's not who you think they are.
Yeah.
Sean knew he was that person deep down inside. He already
We just didn't know yet.
And Katie is standing in for the audience, exactly.
Right.
So we are learning this thing about Shang-Chi.
And sometimes it's flipped, right? Sometimes we know Spider-Man is, has got this power, but we need to, the joy is watching them learn it.
Or a fun thing in an action movie is when when you know who John Wick is, and the bad guy's like, hey buddy.
Yeah.
And you're like, uh-oh,
here we go.
This dude made a mistake. That's always fun too. And so then the fight progresses and the story is changing and now there's real danger. And then I start focusing on how do I raise the tension of the fight now that the story is pretty well established. And that looks like the brakes get cut. The driver is knocked out, right? Like all these increasingly insane things happen that require Sean to react in different ways. So now he's showing that he can fight. He's keeping himself safe. He's keeping civilians safe.
Right.
He has to save other people.
Everybody run to the front.
And so that's what I'm trying to... I want you to feel the excitement. I really like that bus sequence, and I have been told that a lot of people have told me that they think it's one of the better Marvel action sequences, and I'm really proud of it. And the goal was always to make it feel on the page like it felt when you watched it, so that there was never going to be every single person who works in the movie knows exactly, okay, I got it. I know what they're going for. Because if I just write a fight sequence happens here, it could be anything, and it could be completely.
Right.
It could be a rad fight sequence that does not feel like it's part of the same movie.
Right.
If it's not telling a story or relating to the characters. So those are the things I'm looking for when I write action. I'm looking for what is the character's perspective, what is the story of the sequence, and then on top of all of that, I love escalation of stakes. The movie I always cite when I talk about this, that I get laughed out of the room every time, but Pirates of the Caribbean 2 opens, or it's somewhere inside of the first of many hours of filmmaking. There's a very long sequence where Jack Sparrow is on an island and he's being rescued by his friends, and there are probably the depiction of the people that he's the captive of is probably not appropriate at this point in what we know about how to make movies, but he's trying to escape and he's got this big stick stuck to his back, and first one thing happens and then another thing happens, and right when you think it couldn't get any worse, another thing happens. And the creativity of that type of action storytelling I find really intoxicating. Just like you think you know what it is, and then it's worse, and then it's worse, and then it's worse. And that's like just really classic, going back to your nerd stuff. Like that's just classic scene work. That's just
raising the stakes.
That's comedy where the joke gets funnier and funnier and funnier. That's drama where the tragedy gets more and more tragic. That should still apply to action.
So what I hear you talking about here feels to me like, you mentioned voice a couple times. Voice is something that's so ineffable that I like don't even want to tell students. I don't even want to use that term with them often because it's so like mystical and mysterious. And like, well, what is my voice? I can do so many different voices, which I'm, sure as a writer you find, well, I can do this voice or this voice or this voice. What advice would you give to people who are struggling to find their voice?
I mean, I believe that your voice is just like the core elemental notion of who you are artistically, which is so obvious to say, but I think that so many people tend to, again, just mute it a little bit, or to be scared of showing their true selves as an artist, because of the expectations of the public or of themselves or of their family or loved ones. Voice to me is just being honest about how I want to express myself. Now I'm working in a medium in which I'm just writing, just quote unquote writing, but now I know for me personally, my voice is just, what that means to me is how I express something on the page is just going to be exactly how I would express it to you, and that's my voice. That might not work for everybody, because how you express things in your head maybe isn't always appropriate, or mine isn't either, but I'm very colloquial in my writing now because I believe that it expresses me, and it's also more fun. Screenplays are really boring to read.
Yeah.
If I can make it more fun for you, it's going to have a better result for both of us.
I wonder if you can think of a specific example of that, where like sort of Dave version 1, first 10 years might have written it more in this way, but now, like, can you think of an example from recent writing where you would express it in this? Because I'm constantly trying to get students to do this and be like, no, write it how you talk. Don't try to put on airs.
I mean, again, it's just, I do a lot of weird asides to the reader now where I say, this is not a specific example, I'm just going to try to freeball this.
Great.
But when I'm trying to describe something that I don't know expertly how to describe, I used to go online and say, okay, what's the name, what is the technical name for the kind of door lock that looks like this? Because it's what I'm picturing, and I want to make sure the director understands that that's the kind of lock that this guy would have on his door. And then I would find it, and I would write, he has a blah lock.
Right.
He opened, and now you're past it, and you don't remember that I ever wrote it, and who fucking cares what it was anyway.
Right.
Now I would write, he goes to his door, and he's got one of those locks. You know the kinds of locks. It's like, kind of looks like a hook, and maybe there's an S in it, and maybe they're not as common. Like with all the maybes and the you-knows, all of that will go on the page.
Right.
And it ultimately still doesn't matter, because at some point a production designer and a director will do what they do. But when directors and executives read that, they feel like they're in conversation with me, and it makes the read more pleasant. And it also is just a much more honest way of speaking, I think. And so that's an example. It's not like something I set out to do. I don't want to say like, I'm always looking for ways to like wink at the reader. It's really just when those moments arise in the page, I just do what's natural now instead of trying to, really, there's a version of trying to do it in a more technical way that's not really that honest to me.
And it feels more distancing in a way.
Like here's an example that is not something I do, but I have done, and I see it all the time because I operate so much inside of the action space. Some writers love to get very technical with their descriptions of weaponry and military equipment.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, and then they get in a blah, 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 blah type of tank, and they pull out their blah, blah, blah guns. And I simultaneously think when I read that, like, wow, this guy knows his stuff, which is worth something, but also it's so cold.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter on the page that you know your stuff,
right?
Because what matters on the page that you know is the tension and terror of being in the military, maybe, as an example, if that's the kind of story you're telling. It does not matter at all that this character knows how to load his Sig Sauer or whatever the case may be. And it's going to get changed anyway when the production team decides what kind of weapons they have access to, like all of that kind of thing.
And so I mentioned distancing because it seems like when you're doing this and you're saying, the kind of lock with this and this, you're building rapport with the reader.
Yeah.
And what you're saying to them is, you are like me and I'm like you. Yeah. And we're on this ride together and we're looking at the thing. Neither of us knows the thing is, but we know the kind of thing it is. And we're looking at it from the same perspective. Mm-hmm. When I see that kind of language, whether it's a student writing it or there's a kind of distancing thing that happens, and I'm like, oh, we are not actually alike. And it seems to me, and I was rewatching Shang-Chi last night, that especially in, for example, an action movie, you need those moments where you're like, oh, this person is like me. And I'll give an example. There's that plane scene when Awkwafina and Seymour are flying, when Sean and Katie are flying, and the flight attendant comes and asks them, do they want vegetarian or beef? And they both say vegetarian, and they're out of it. And then she goes, okay, well, beef, I guess. And then she's like, okay, one beef. And then she turns to, Sean's character, and it's like, what about you? And he's like, beef, And she, Awkwafina has this moment where she looks at her like, seriously? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like her and she's like me. Yeah. And in a world where these folks are going to do incredible things and they're going to fight, and fight dragons and stuff, I feel like we need those moments.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing I like to do in those types of movies, is to have humor based in like the banalities of life.
Yeah.
Like the weird, hilarious, like you wouldn't probably even identify that as something funny that happened to you on an airplane, but when you see it happen to other people, you realize it's funny.
Right.
And so that is definitely something I think is fun in those types of movies. I don't know if there's a passion there. Thanks. I'm glad you like it.
Great.
It used to be much longer. The first version of that I wrote was that stewardess, because that scene, I don't remember how it's edited now, but the first time I wrote that scene, he was explaining to her this very mind-boggling backstory. She was discovered for the first time. I don't know who you are. Who are you? And he's like, well,
I'll tell you.
My dad was a terrorist warlord who's lived for thousands of years, and it's insane to have to listen to something like that.
Yeah.
And he's your best friend. You think you know the person. So the way I had written it initially was how funny it would be is you are telling the most incredible, mind-boggling, like paradigm-shifting story. You're not just telling this person, you don't know me. You're also telling this person, well, there's magic in the world,
right? And
my dad is an eternal, basically. He's an immortal. Her whole vision of how the world operates is being changed. And then, like every 2 minutes, it's interrupted by this stewardess who keeps coming back with something else and just obliterating the tension of the story.
Yeah.
It was very funny to write. It was a little much.
What did you write your college essay about?
Okay. The caveat here is I wrote my college essay 30 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And it either no longer exists anywhere or exists solely on a floppy disk somewhere inside of my parents' basement.
Or on this podcast. It's about to exist right now.
So I have not revisited my college essay, and I don't remember much about the mindset I might have been in when concocting it. I wrote my college essay about my admiration for a Norwegian speed skater named Johan Olav Koss.
Like you do.
Had at the time, I don't know if it was the year of the Winter Olympics or several years after a specific Winter Olympics, but this was a speed skater who had, my memory of it is that he was essentially like the Usain Bolt of speed skaters. This guy kind of had been known, but in that particular Olympics ended up beating people in a fashion that would have previously been thought unthinkable and shattering records that were never going to be shattered, et cetera, et cetera. I don't remember. I don't know. Why did I do that? You're not.
I'm so curious. I'm so curious. Yes.
And I'm mostly asking myself, why did I do that? I don't know that there was a prompt, though. If there was one, it was some version of someone you admire. And I think that,
interesting.
I don't know. I guess all I can point to there is to say that is pretty typical of an attitude I've always carried with me when answering questions, which is, well, I know what you expect the answer to be. And I'm not going to go against it solely for the sake of it, but because most people are probably going to talk about family members or Gandhi, it's less like for the sake of just being difficult, and it's more just for like, you're going to be so bored if I tell you about my dad, the surgeon, who saves lives for a living, an actual admirable person. Instead, what I'm going to do is guarantee that you have not read another essay that's like this.
Right.
And so that's what I did. And I think I wrote it in a style that was pretty similar to what I've been describing along the way, which is a little loose, a little looser than maybe what some people think that they should write for a college essay. I don't know what is happening in the world of college essays, right?
Well, so I want to offer this, because as we're talking, I'm like, there's so much that you've been sharing with me in the last hour plus that feels juicy and feels like, so here I'm gonna put you on the spot. I'm gonna give you a redo here, college essay redo. Ready? So here's the prompt, because I would be curious to hear you think through. If I were to say to you had to write a page now, and the prompt is something like, describe the world you come from and how it's shaped your dreams and aspirations. I'd love to just hear your thought process, because that is a prompt that
and this is not unlike what I do for a living too, which is interesting. Or not interesting. I don't know. Not interesting.
Interesting to me and interesting to you, and that's what
nobody else. My instinct, the minute you said that, is I start thinking as you're still asking the question, because professionally, when someone says, "What would you do with Mortal Kombat?" I'm already doing that. And my instinct immediately was like, oh, I would describe a fantasy world. I would describe like this collage world of all of my interests as a real physical space where I am living in a place where heavy music is playing and professional wrestlers exist in the same place as Dante. And I would try to express all of the things that I think, and you know, my Asian heritage and all of these things. Is there a way for me to get all of that into a globe that I can then describe myself standing inside of? That's how I would have attempted to do that. Yeah. Which I think my instinct to do that, again, comes from the same place of, I think it'll be more interesting, and I think it'll be more expressive, even if it's not as literal.
Yeah. I love hearing that. And it's so, I feel so aligned with you on this. And part of like, when I work with students, it's about how do you get all of that stuff? How do you get the heavy metal music and the interest in wrestlers and HVAC systems?
Yeah. And the answer is you can't do that in a page unless you get weird.
Yeah.
Unless you start using fragmented sentences and poetic imagery. So that's what I would attempt.
Yeah. So it seems like in terms of the phase of writing this, there's this sort of getting weirdness, which I would call brainstorming. And then at some point there comes, all right, let's figure out how all this connects or makes sense. Right. So I'm assuming, but tell me how it goes for you when you're writing. Let's say you were to write something that is like a personal statement. How much time do you spend in the sort of get weird brainstorming time? And then before you're like, all right, let's get in and figure out how all this stuff connects.
I'll spend as much time as I need to in the brainstorming stage to make sure that it's not going to bore me to death to write. That's the other thing I haven't mentioned is I have to write it.
Right.
And writing can be tedious.
Right.
As an exercise, because you're physically in one place and you're looking at a screen that's inevitably breaking your brain. So yeah, I will. this is a big part of my process actually, is, okay, I have to write a treatment. A treatment is the most boring thing you could write. A treatment is basically just prose explaining the script that you're going to write later without any of the emotionality.
Right. It's sort of like the summary. It's like the 10 to 20 page, like, here's what you can expect.
So I will sit down and I'll think, like, what is my approach to this that's going to make this readable, but also like achievable for me without wanting to blow my brains out. And so I would do the same thing in this case. I would make sure in my head I really understood what the approach would be. I do outline a lot when I'm trying. I outline for the purposes of story. I outline, here's the story beats. Shang-Chi does this and Shang-Chi does that, and then there's a fight scene here. I don't outline for structure generally. Like, I have a pretty good ability to, in my head, go like, okay, I think I know what the introduction is going to look like, and I'll combine that with just winging it and trying things. I'm very willing to try a bunch of stuff on the page, but I always tell people this applies to treatments, this applies to scripts, it applies to writing that is non-creative, that I still sometimes might end up doing if I'm, an example would be like an arbitration letter that we have to do sometimes. There's an arbitration process that the Writers Guild goes through when you are determining credit, and you have to write a letter to the Writers Guild explaining why you should have your name on the movie. That's like a legal brief. Yeah. Super boring. But the same thing is true, which is I always tell people, the first thing that you get from me in your brain will be a first draft because it's the first time you've seen it. It will be the 50th draft that exists. Right. I will iterate on myself. I will change literal I will experiment with different punctuation on every sentence of everything you've ever read. And by the time you've seen it, I'm confident, like, no, the exclamation point was right. That's how I do it. So I'm willing to forego a lot of work up front, outlining and planning, and more finding it in the rewriting, in the editing.
Awesome. If you could go back and do college again, what would you do differently?
Do college again. I had a great college experience, I will say. I went to the University of Michigan, which is a very, very large school. It's a great school. It's a great research facility. It's a great academic program. And obviously, a lot of people are familiar with the school because of the same reason that I went there, which is it has really cool sports teams that do very well. Which was important to me because the result of that is not just that you get to watch football, it's that the entire campus many times a year gets swept up in a singular tidal wave of emotion and spirit and pride, which feels really exciting. So I wanted that large college experience. And I went to college in Michigan from the Bay Area specifically to live life. I was looking at college as less of an academic pursuit and more as a time to learn how to be a human pursuit. I was pretty reserved. I had, you're not asking this, but I think it's relevant. I was very academic, but I was not great socially coming out of high school. I had never been to a party. Not that a party is the critical element of college, but I hadn't been to one, and I didn't know how to make new friends. I'd had the same friends for my whole life because I grew up in a small community where my friends are basically just assigned to me by virtue of having parents in the same socioeconomic environment, and they also weren't the popular kids. Sorry, excuse me. Okay. So for me, college was I need to live life. I need to know what it is to wake up on my own in the morning and feed myself, meet new friends, to challenge myself. Academics, I was like, that'll be the easy part for me. And it was. And it was because I dropped out of the honors program the minute I got there, did my English thing, which I was good at. I didn't, and that's the thing I think I would change, which is, so I did I think a very good job of learning to be a person and having great experiences. I look very fondly back on college and make great friends. What I didn't do was, because I was so far in the zone of trying desperately to live and be social, I always thought of the academics at college as like, whatever. Right. And I got a great English education there. There's obviously excellent professors and resources at a school like that. But what I didn't understand fully about college until my senior year was like, you don't have to just take the classes that you're supposed to take.
Right.
You can take, I mean, I don't know how all colleges work, but at Michigan, as long as I check off X amount of boxes to get the degree that I'm supposed to get, which I do need to do, then there's all this other space, and I have to fill it with credits of some kind. And
Totally.
Senior year was the first time I was like, do they have art here?
Mm-hmm.
And spoiler alert, at the University of Michigan, yes, there is art.
Turns out.
It's on a different campus, which is why I didn't know about it and why I had always like reserved myself from exploring it. So I was like, I'm going to take an art class. So I got on a bus every day and I drove up to the North Campus and I took jewelry making. I took a drawing class. I got back into my interest in biology, knowing that I couldn't major in it, but there were a lot of interesting classes inside of the major that I just could take. So I took a class called Sharks.
Wow.
I was interested.
Yeah.
You know, I just took a lot of weird classes that were specific to my interest. The thing I guess a thing I would just say about myself is that I am, and we joke about how much I like HVAC as an example. The reason I like HVAC is because I have HVAC in my house that I need to know how it works. But more specifically, when I go on like my Instagram, one day I was influenced, like the algorithm served me up an HVAC influencer.
Oh, cool.
Which I did not know existed.
Yeah.
Like a guy who's very popular in the HVAC world. And I just spent hours looking at all of his stuff. And then I was like, well, who does he follow? Right? Like all of which is to say, I have, I'm very intellectually curious in things that aren't the things that are central to my life. I really love, and I'm super interested in like, and not everything. I'm not interested in Bitcoin. I'm interested in it, and I don't know what it's going to be until I find it. But like HVAC, I don't know why. I'm interested. I want to learn more. I wanted to learn more about sharks. And my point is, at a place like the University of Michigan, if that is the type of college environment you end up in, essentially anything you can think of is probably available to you.
Totally.
Either through direct classes or extension classes or campuses that might, in the example of Michigan, there are other campuses that you can take classes at as well. I'm assuming things have changed radically from even when I was in college, and now there must be a lot of online opportunities. But also, you can take that lesson social and go back to the thing I went there for. I made a lot of friends and I went to a lot of parties and I went to a lot of football games. What I didn't do is join a lot of clubs. What I didn't do is explore a lot of, outreach beyond just being a social person. And I think most colleges have a lot of opportunities for that too. My brother went to Michigan as well several years after me, and he had a very bad time. He didn't explore anything, even less than I did. And what I always tell people about Michigan is like, yeah, it's like one of those places. A lot like LA is actually. I think of like LA as a city. Yeah. If you can dream it, it's probably here somewhere. But you do have to work to find it sometimes, and you might have to step outside of your comfort zone to get to it. If you want to go snowboarding and at the same day end up at the beach, you can do that in LA. It's not easy, but you can do it. At Michigan, I felt like, I look back on it now, and I knew then to a degree, but I look back now having a much greater understanding of sort of like the world, I think. Yeah, it's all right there. Some of these college campuses are like small worlds to themselves. They're international students there. There's just so much going on. So I would have liked to have explored more, because I only found out I like HVAC from Instagram. Like, what if I had found that out in college?
We wouldn't even be here.
No, maybe, but we'd be talking about something different.
I want to hear from your perspective, how do you think Hollywood's doing in terms of representation now? Like what grade does Hollywood get?
I will say that this is just my experience of it. I know that everybody is having different experiences with representation right now, so I want to be careful about that. I mean, look, I've been doing what I've been doing for 20 years, and I think unequivocally representation is better. I think that Hollywood is doing better than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I mean, that sounds obvious, but it's not always obvious. I don't think 10 years ago I would have said that of the previous 10 years. I think that there's been some very public movements towards putting more types of people on screen, different faces, different bodies, different experiences, different stories. And I think that's great. I think it's super important. You know, it's interesting because with Shang-Chi as an example, because it's maybe the best example of representation on screen that I've worked on. You know, sometimes people don't understand why it's so important, and it's only when I have to explain, like, imagine like the way that you grew up and everybody you saw on screen looked like you. You believe that you could be any of those things. The only thing I believed I could be, based on Western media, was like an Asian man can't be an NFL player. An Asian man can't be a rock star. An Asian man can't be a movie star. He can maybe be a sidekick, and he can maybe be the butt of jokes. Like, imagine what that does to somebody. So that, to me, is why representation is super important on screen. Like, even I've had people, I've said, I think we're doing okay. I think we're doing better. I think it's good the direction we're headed in. And I've had people push back and say, we have so much further to go. It's like, of course we have much further to go. But Shang-Chi is super important. Black Panther is super important, you know, and it's not just superhero movies, but those have a very wide audience reach, which is also important. Crazy Rich Asians before us. So I think that it's getting better. I think that people are more open to hearing stories when on the pitching stage at the studio level of people that don't look like them. And they're more aware now that there are audiences for larger, diverse groups. I do think there's still quite a bit of hesitance to actually spend money on those projects and put them on screen. I hear all the time about things that seem really obvious to me that are still butting up against it. But, you know, I think we're doing better.
What is it going to take when you hear folks say, well, we've got so much work to do? What are some of the things that will have to shift, do you think?
It's just about being normalized. You know, I think that the reason people just don't bother making an Asian-led superhero movie for the entire history of Hollywood, and I know there have been Asians in superhero movies, and I know obviously outside of Hollywood there have been plenty of movies that center Asian heroes, but it's just no one ever, like, if you don't notice what's not there, if you're not looking for it, and especially if you are a white male, as an example, there's so much other stuff for you being presented that you wouldn't maybe notice what's not there for somebody else. And so the more you see those types of things, the more, you know, an Asian story is always I'm going to be very aware of all the Asian-led movies that are out there because I'm an Asian person who's looking for movies that speak to that part of me. But Black Panther opened my eyes in a certain way, and I think that, you know, if we can get more movies that are not just about like the ethnicity or the color of the skin of the person, but also if we're talking about like able-bodiedness versus disabled people, disabilities, or, you know, gender fluidity, all that kind of stuff, I think that would probably be a place I'd like to see a lot of improvement. And the only way that can be improved upon, I think, is if we just slowly normalize differentness inside of society. It's the only way to get people, like, right now I don't imagine I could convince a certain type of person in Arkansas to go see a certain type of movie about queer identity. But maybe in a couple of years, if enough of the conversation is being had constantly, they no longer have the aversion to it or thinking of it as strange or niche. It's just another story. Why wouldn't we have stories for everybody?
Is there anything that people don't ask you about as it relates to screenwriting that you kind of love to talk about?
I mean, the soapbox I like to stand on, thank you, Ethan, for asking.
Now's your chance.
Is I just want to impress upon the general public, if I may, that the movies that you see are not the screenplays that are written. And that is meant both to defend writers, but also to not give us too much credit. Sometimes credit is due and sometimes it is not. But I think there's a real misunderstanding, and this is reflected when you see people talking about movies, which everybody does now and everybody always has. But now with the advent of social media, lucky me, I get to know what every single person alive thinks of the movies I write.
At any time, day or night.
This would just be, I know what Roger Ebert thinks, and now it's, you know, if I were to look, I could find out. And I will frequently see, I saw this movie, the screenplay sucked. And every time I just want to say, it might have sucked, but it also might not have sucked. And I feel very, very strongly that a screenplay is a different product from a movie. It is a part of the ingredients. The final product of a writer is part of the many ingredients that go into the final product of a film.
Yeah.
But they're not the same thing. Meaning, I write a script. You could take a great script of mine, hypothetically, because that doesn't usually exist, but you could take a great script, and now there are so many other processes that have to happen to that script. You have to have a budget to be able to find locations that match what's on the page. You have to be able to do stunts. You have to find actors who may or may not be able to capture the essence of what's on the page. And by the end, the result could be terrible or great or just very different, more often than not. You could also take a very bad script, get several of the best actors in the world, wing it on a couple of days, have a great DP, and come out with a masterpiece.
Right.
It's harder to do that because at some point you need good structure again. But all of which is simply to say, I am appreciative when people tell me that they love the movies that I've written, and I'm always glad for it, and I don't take it personally if they don't. I just want to say, what you love is the movie, and if you're interested in knowing what screenplays look like or judging screenplays, the screenplays are very readily available online now, and I would always encourage people who are interested in filmmaking to know what those look like too.
Right.
And it can be connected. If you were to read the screenplay for The Social Network, you'd be like, yeah. I understand entirely how a wonderful movie came out of this, but that's not only because of the excellent screenplay. It's because an excellent director then made every correct choice along the way to get it to the screen.
Is being a screenwriter all it's cracked up to be?
Excuse me. Yeah, for me, I've had a really fortuitous, lucky, hardworking career, and I've learned a lot along the way, and a lot of the stuff that I had hoped to get out of it I've gotten, so that's lucky for me. At the same time, screenwriting is like not a totality. It's literally it could be an infinite number of jobs, because every single person who does it slightly differently, hopes to get something different out of it, is going to be doing it at a different moment in time where there are different elements in and out of your control. You can control more and more of it the more you know what to look for, the more you can read the tea leaves. But if I had been doing this exact same job in the 80s, it'd be really different. I was doing this exact same job. Same me. 20 years from now, I assume it will be very different then too. But right now, screenwriting can be really great. It's creative. The reason I started it way back when, to be honest, was just as much wanting to do something creative with my life as it was knowing that a structured 9-to-5 have to go into an office lifestyle was never going to be for me. I was going to want a freedom that allowed me to travel and to have a family and spend time with my family, and to not have to ask anybody for permission if I want to go away for 2 days. And so it's definitely cracked up for that. I mean, it's been really good to me.
What advice would you give to young writers, young screenwriters, or just young writers?
I think the only advice I know how to give to young screenwriters right now, because we are living in I want to say a sea change, but it's actually been like a 10-year sea change now. There was no streamers when I started. There was still DVD. Everything is changing so rapidly, and now the technology is changing too. So I don't know what movie making and filmmaking in the entertainment industry is going to even look like. So I can't really speak to what a screenwriter's life will be like by the time that someone currently applying to college, coming out of college even. That's how fast it's all moving. But I just feel really strongly that I have succeeded by virtue of hard work, which is going to be the case for most anything, I suspect, but also for, as I've described to you, being willing to be my own voice and not try to be anything other than that. And it can feel scary because maybe maybe no one who's done it before you get there has done it the way you want to do it. But it doesn't mean it's not doable that way. You're just going to be the person who does it for the first time that way. I think there's space for that in every facet of life, whether it's professional or personal or anything else. So yeah, I guess my only advice to writers is just like, be the writer you want to be and write about the things you want to write about. Don't write what you think they want. You know,
I want to end with some rapid fire questions. I'm just going to fire off a few at you and see what happens. Ready? Best movie of the last 5 years.
Barbie.
Movie moment that always makes you cry.
At the end of Armageddon, when Liv Tyler and Bruce Willis put their hands up to the screens and say goodbye to one another.
A book that you wish you had written.
Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. Do you know that book?
No.
It's your listeners probably are aware of it. It's a book about video game designers that has been very, very highly rated for the last couple of years. To be clear, I'm not capable of writing it. It is astonishingly well written.
Awesome. Guilty pleasure movie.
Almost all of my favorite movies are guilty pleasures. How about Tremors?
Nice.
Do you know Tremors?
Yeah, I do. Movie that not enough people have seen, but is great in your mind.
Hot Rod, starring Andy Samberg.
Awesome.
That's a movie that I was aware of it. It was not financially successful and written off when it initially came out. And when I finally saw it, I was like, how come no one told me about this movie? And so now I try to share the gospel.
Movie that you would like to write before you die.
I don't think I have one of those anymore. I feel really lucky. Cool. I feel like I've explored so much. I'm sure I'm gonna get in my car. I'm like, oh, but I'm not pining after anything right now. I don't want for that, which is really fortunate for me.
That is really cool.